Relations between the United States and Cuba are very complex. Once a close ally, Cuba later rose to become one of the greatest threats to the United States. Meanwhile, Cuba is increasingly leaving isolation, which has improved relations again. Since the U.S. has always regarded Central and South America as its own so-called geopolitical backyard, it also increasingly exerted influence on the states there, gaining control over entire territories such as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. For a short time, they even gained control over the largest Caribbean island, Cuba. But how did this happen in the first place, and how did Cuba become independent again? Cuba was ruled by the Spanish for 4 centuries after the arrival of Christopher Columbus, being one of the most important colonies in the Caribbean. In 1823, the Americans announced their interest in the island for the first time. At that time, the Monroe Doctrine played an important role in American understanding, with the motto, "America to the Americans." This was to justify further expansion of the United States. The Cuban population was fed up with the foreign rule of the Spaniards, which is why ever greater efforts for independence were made. Cuba could also appear self-confident, as it had meanwhile risen to become the world's leading sugar producer. In a first war of independence, fought between 1868 and 1878, the Cubans won far-reaching special rights, such as free trade and greater autonomy from Spain. Cuba was now able to trade directly with the United States for the first time, which intensified relations. Particularly due to the declining importance of Spain, the Cuban economy came more and more under U.S. influence. Sugar plantations owned by Spaniards and Cubans fell into the hands of U.S. businessmen, U.S. capital flooded the country, and sugar producers eventually became completely dependent on the United States. As in 1894, almost 90% of Cuban exports went to the United States and 38% of Cuban imports also came from the United States. In comparison, only 6% of Cuban exports went to Spain and only 35% of imports came from the mother country. With the waning of Spanish sovereignty, Cuba now sought complete independence, which is why the Second War of Independence broke out in 1895. When, in the turmoil of the war, the USS Maine exploded in an unexplained manner in Havana Harbor in February 1898, killing 250 American sailors, the United States saw the opportune moment to enter the war. Under the propaganda slogan, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," Cuba was to be militarily liberated from Spain and the business interests of the USA were to be protected. Thus, even as the tide of war was turning, the Spanish were vastly outnumbered by the United States. Thus, Spain surrendered before the end of 1898. In the subsequent peace treaty, the U.S. received not only Puerto Rico, Guam, and the entire Philippines, but also the country it had had its eye on for decades, Cuba, arguably the most strategically important island in the Caribbean. The Cubans, however, were very unhappy with this. Instead of their independence, the American flag now flew in the Bay of Havana. The Americans, who were primarily concerned with economic interests, therefore agreed after several years of negotiations to withdraw their troops, but only on condition that the U.S. had a permanent right to intervene militarily to protect strategic and business interests. Cuba thus received formal independence in 1902, after about 3.5 years of American occupation, but in real terms was a puppet state of the United States. In addition, the Americans received the southern part of Guantanamo Bay, where one of the cruelest prison camps was later built. The Americans made use of their right of military invasion again and again in the following decades. Only in 1934 the then U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt canceled all conditions of the treaty except for the occupation of Guantanamo. Nevertheless, the Americans intervened again in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was intended to overthrow Fidel Castro, who had been freeing Cuba from the clutches of the United States since he took office in 1959. How do you think history would have unfolded if the Americans had not released Cuba into formal independence in 1902, but perhaps even incorporated it into their own territory as a U.S. state? Feel free to write it in the comments.